It was supposed to be just another ordinary trip. I had my boarding pass in one hand, a lukewarm coffee in the other, and a playlist ready to drown out the chaos of the airport. The announcements of flight delays echoed overhead, blending into the background noise of rolling luggage, hurried footsteps, and the occasional frustrated sigh. People around me were either glued to their phones or pacing impatiently, desperate for updates. The air was thick with frustration and exhaustion, the kind you can almost feel pressing against your skin. I remember staring blankly at the departure board, watching the flickering words change my fate. Delayed for hours. I muttered something under my breath, debating whether to grab another overpriced sandwich or stake out a corner to wait. Little did I know, the real adventure wasn't in the skies but in that crowded terminal, where life had decided to throw me a twist I could have never planned for. It all started with a glance. A fleeting moment that might have gone unnoticed in a different setting, but here, amidst the chaos, it felt like the universe had nudged me. Across the waiting area, there he was, casual, unbothered, and completely engrossed in a book, as if the delay didn't faze him at all. His calmness was striking, like he belonged in a scene far away from the hectic shuffle of the terminal. I couldn't look away, and for reasons I couldn't yet explain, I didn't want to. It wasn't love at first sight, not exactly. It was more like a question, an unspoken challenge. Who is this person, and why do they seem untouched by everything unraveling around us? And just as I was about to dismiss it as nothing more than a passing curiosity, he looked up. Our eyes met briefly, almost too quickly, and in that single moment, something shifted. What followed wasn't the fairytale kind of instant connection people write about. It was awkward, messy, and filled with moments that would have made anyone else give up. But for some reason, I couldn't. Maybe it was the way he smiled at the chaos around him, or maybe it was the way that chaos seemed to pause, just for a second, when he smiled back at me. Looking back now, I realized that those endless hours of waiting weren't just a delay, they were a beginning. And as I recount this story, I can't help but wonder, was it fate, coincidence, or just the universe's strange way of setting the stage for something unforgettable? Let me introduce myself. I'm Logan, your average frequent flyer with a knack for picking the worst days to travel. If there's a storm, an overbooked flight, or an inexplicable delay, you can bet I'll be there, in the middle of it, wondering what I did to deserve such luck. I'm the type who packs snacks like it's a survival mission and curates playlists so specific they could double as movie soundtracks. My airport strategy is simple: keep my head down, find a comfortable corner, and wait out the madness without losing my sanity. That day, however, no amount of snacks or music could have prepared me for what was about to unfold. Now, my partner, well, at the time, he wasn't even a blip on my radar. But let me tell you about him as I saw him that day. Picture this: a guy sitting in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs, totally at ease, as if he'd stepped out of a calm, parallel universe. He had a book in his hands, a real book, not an e-reader, and I remember thinking, who even carries actual books to the airport anymore? His headphones were slung casually around his neck, and every now and then, he'd glance up from the pages, observing the chaos around him with a faint, amused smile. There was something about him, something that stood out, even in the sea of tired faces and frustrated travelers. Maybe it was the way he looked, completely unbothered, as though delays were just another part of life to be embraced rather than endured. Or maybe it was the way his presence seemed to carve out a quiet bubble amidst the noise. Whatever it was, it made me hesitate. I'm not the type to strike up conversations with strangers, I usually keep to myself, but for some reason, I couldn't look away. And then came the thoughts, those little self-doubts that creep in when you least need them. He's probably waiting for someone. Someone cooler, someone who belongs in his world. He's reading Tolstoy, for crying out loud. What am I going to do? Talk to him about the latest airport sandwich trends? I laughed to myself, quietly, shaking my head at the absurdity of it all. But here's the thing about first impressions, they're rarely accurate. What I saw in that moment was a guy who seemed perfect, untouchable, as though life couldn't throw him off balance. What I didn't know was that he was just as human as the rest of us, navigating his own frustrations and uncertainties in that terminal. And if there's one thing I've learned since that day, it's that the people who seem the most composed often have the most interesting stories to tell. Back then, though, I didn't know any of this. All I had was my overactive imagination, a growing curiosity, and a delayed flight that gave me far too much time to wonder what his story might be. Little did I know, I was about to find out. The airport that day was a perfect storm of chaos and exhaustion. Picture this: rows upon rows of travelers slumped in uncomfortable chairs, some with heads buried in their hands, others staring aimlessly at their phones, as if the force of their gaze could will a miracle. Children were crying, the kind of loud, unfiltered wails that seemed to pierce through every layer of your sanity, while parents tried their best to soothe them, juggling bags, snacks, and frayed tempers. Somewhere in the distance, an overworked gate agent announced yet another delay, their voice cracking under the weight of collective disappointment. The air smelled like a strange mix of cleaning chemicals, overpriced coffee, and reheated pretzels. The departure board loomed over everyone like a judge delivering bad news, its glowing letters flashing delayed beside almost every flight. Every few minutes, a loud ding would precede another announcement that no one seemed to care about anymore. People had resigned themselves to waiting, some sprawled out on the floor like stranded travelers in a low-budget disaster movie. And there I was, stuck in the middle of it all, trying to make the best of an increasingly frustrating situation. My coffee had gone cold. My phone battery was hanging on for dear life. I had already scrolled through my playlist twice, skipping songs I wasn't in the mood for. I looked around, hoping to find some distraction, some small relief from the monotony, and that's when I saw him again. He hadn't moved much since the last time I noticed him, still engrossed in his book, legs crossed, looking as if he'd made peace with the delay long before the rest of us. There was something about his calm demeanor that was almost infuriating in a situation like this. How could anyone be so unaffected? But the truth was, his composure fascinated me. It was the kind of confidence that wasn't loud or showy. It simply existed, quietly drawing attention without asking for it. I spent far too long debating whether I should approach him, the kind of internal struggle that turns a simple decision into a mental marathon. My first excuse was that he was probably too busy reading to notice me. My second excuse was that I had nothing interesting to say. My third was the fear of embarrassing myself in front of a terminal full of strangers. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized how ridiculous I was being. And then, as if fate or maybe just my clumsy tendencies decided to give me a nudge, my phone charger slipped out of my hand and tumbled to the floor, sliding a good few feet away. Of course, it landed right at his feet. I froze for a second, caught between mortification and the absurdity of the moment, before reluctantly getting up to retrieve it. He noticed me before I could reach down, and with a quick, effortless movement, he picked up the charger and held it out to me. "Yours, I assume," he said, his voice calm, with a hint of amusement. It was such a simple sentence, but in that moment, it felt like the icebreaker I'd been too nervous to come up with. "Yeah, thanks," I said, probably a little too quickly. It has a habit of running away from me. A weak joke, sure, but it got a small smile out of him, which I counted as a win. "Flight delayed too?" he asked, even though it was obvious. There was a kindness in his tone, like he genuinely wanted to engage, not just make polite small talk. "Yep, looks like we're all in this for the long haul," I replied, gesturing vaguely to the crowded terminal. "I've got snacks, though, so I guess I'm prepared for the apocalypse." His laugh was quiet but warm, the kind of sound that makes you want to keep talking, just to hear it again. "Snacks and optimism," he said. "A winning combination." I wanted to keep the conversation going, but my brain felt like it was working overtime to find the right words. Before I could overthink it, I nodded toward the book in his hands. "What are you reading?" That question turned out to be the key to unlocking a flood of conversation. He held up the cover of a novel I vaguely recognized and started telling me about why he liked it. His voice was steady, thoughtful, and surprisingly animated for someone who'd been so quietly reserved. I found myself getting drawn in, not so much by the book he was describing but by the way he spoke about it, with a passion that made even the most mundane details seem interesting. Before I knew it, we were no longer strangers in a crowded terminal. We were two people sharing a moment, carving out a small oasis of connection in the midst of all the noise and chaos. And as the hours stretched on, I realized that this delay, frustrating as it was, might just be the best thing that could have happened to me. The hours at the terminal seemed to stretch endlessly, but for the first time that day, I didn't mind. What started as a clumsy exchange over a dropped charger turned into a conversation that felt natural, even easy. His name was Adam, and he had this way of speaking that drew you in, calm, thoughtful, with a slight lilt in his tone that made every word sound just a little more interesting. We talked about everything: favorite books, our worst travel experiences, and the unspoken competition between overpriced airport coffee chains. But beneath the humor and casual banter, there was something else, a pull I couldn't quite explain. Every so often, I'd catch him looking at me, and in those moments, it felt like the rest of the terminal, the noise, the chaos just faded into the background. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, it was quiet, subtle, and it made my heart race in a way I wasn't entirely ready for. Then, just as the conversation was hitting its stride, the loudspeaker crackled with an announcement. "Attention, passengers on Flight 372. Your delay has been extended by an additional 2 hours." A collective groan rippled through the terminal. I glanced at Adam, expecting frustration, or at least a sigh, but instead, he just smirked and said, "Well, looks like we have more time to figure out if you really know what the best travel snack is." His lightheartedness was infectious. I laughed, even though part of me was still nervous. I wanted to keep talking, to keep finding reasons to stay in this bubble we'd created. But then, he threw me a curveball I wasn't expecting. "My family's here, you know," he said casually, like he was mentioning the weather. "They're on the same flight. Want to meet them." Now, let me tell you something. Meeting someone's family isn't usually step two when you've just met them in an airport. My immediate reaction was a mix of panic and disbelief. "I mean, what do you say to that?" "Sure, let me just introduce myself to the people who raised you while I'm still figuring out how to form full sentences around you." But before I could overthink it, he stood up and nodded toward a cluster of seats a few rows down. "Come on, they don't bite." I followed him, trying to play it cool, even though my pulse was doing its best impression of a drum solo. His family was seated together, a mix of personalities that I could sense even before they said a word. His mom had this warm, welcoming energy, like the kind of person who bakes cookies for the neighbors and genuinely remembers your name. His dad was more reserved, with a quiet seriousness that made me sit up a little straighter. And then there was his younger sister, who looked at me like she'd already figured me out within the first 5 seconds. "This is Logan," Adam said, his voice steady, as if this was the most natural introduction in the world. "We met during the delay." I wasn't sure what to expect: polite smiles, a few questions maybe, but his mom surprised me by breaking into a wide grin. "Well, thank goodness for delays, then," she said, her tone so genuinely cheerful that I couldn't help but relax a little. "Adam never talks to anyone at airports. You must be special." That comment sent a wave of heat to my face, but Adam just laughed, brushing it off like it was nothing. "I'm full of surprises," he said, glancing at me with a teasing smile that made it hard to focus on anything else. The conversation that followed was an experience. His mom asked all the classic questions: where I was from, what I did for work, how I ended up on this particular flight. His dad chimed in occasionally, his words careful and deliberate, while his sister alternated between texting on her phone and throwing in sarcastic comments that only siblings can get away with. At one point, Adam's mom leaned over and said, "You seem like a nice guy. Just so you know, Adam can be a bit of a handful, but he's worth it." It was meant as a lighthearted remark, but it hit me in a way I wasn't expecting. I glanced at Adam, who was laughing at something his sister had said, and for a moment, I saw him not as the calm, composed stranger from earlier, but as someone layered, complex, and very, very real. When the conversation finally wrapped up and we returned to our seats, I felt like I'd just completed an emotional marathon. Adam must have noticed, because he chuckled and said, "They're a lot, huh? My sister especially." "They're great," I replied honestly, though my nerves were still catching up. "Your mom's intimidatingly nice." He grinned at that, a soft kind of smile that made my chest feel oddly warm. "She likes you," he said simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. And then, after a pause, he added, "I do too." It was a quiet confession, delivered without fanfare, but it hit me harder than any grand declaration ever could. I looked at him, this stranger who wasn't really a stranger anymore, and for the first time that day, I let myself wonder what might happen after we boarded that plane. As the hours dragged on, something strange started to happen. What began as small talk, a few jokes about the absurdity of airport food and complaints about the never-ending announcements, gradually morphed into something else. Adam had this knack for turning the mundane into something worth laughing about. Like when we both agreed that the prepackaged sandwiches were less food and more an experiment in endurance, or when he noticed an elderly man pacing near the vending machines and whispered, "He's on a mission to save the world one bag of pretzels at a time." I laughed so hard I almost spilled my water. The connection between us felt effortless, like we'd known each other far longer than a few hours, and the more we talked, the more I realized how much we had in common. We both loved traveling, not just the idea of it, but the actual experience of discovering new places and meeting new people. He told me about his trip to Spain, how he spent an entire day lost in the streets of Barcelona, eating churros and practicing his barely passable Spanish with the locals. I told him about my failed attempt to hike in Scotland, where I got caught in the rain and ended up taking shelter in a pub, soaking wet and laughing with strangers over a pint. "Sounds like we both have a talent for turning disasters into stories," he said, grinning. "Maybe we're more alike than I thought." I wanted to agree, but the truth was, Adam seemed like the kind of person I always aspired to be: calm, confident, and unbothered by the little things. Meanwhile, I was the guy who carried 3 backup chargers in his bag because, in my mind, even a dead phone was a catastrophe. And yet, somehow, we just clicked. As the hours passed, the conversations deepened. What started as light-hearted banter shifted into something more personal. Adam told me about his family, his mom's love of gardening, his dad's quiet sense of humor, and his sister's endless determination to prove everyone wrong. He spoke about them with such fondness that it made me think about my own family, how I hadn't called my mom in weeks, and how my brother and I rarely saw eye to eye but always found a way to laugh through our differences. "I guess I'm lucky," he said after a pause. "We don't always agree, but at the end of the day, we're there for each other." "What about you?" That question caught me off guard. I wasn't used to talking about myself so openly, especially with someone I'd just met. But something about Adam's expression, warm, curious, without a hint of judgment, made it easy to be honest. I told him about my family, the struggles and the joys, the things I missed and the things I didn't. It wasn't always pretty, but it was real, and he listened like every word mattered. Somewhere in the middle of all this, I realized I wasn't just talking to a stranger anymore. Adam had become someone I trusted, someone who made the chaos of the airport fade into the background. It was like we'd built this little world just for the two of us, and for the first time that day, I wasn't in a rush for it to end. But, of course, nothing is ever that simple. Just as I was starting to feel comfortable, the universe decided to throw in a curveball. We were talking about dreams, his to someday open a small bookstore by the coast, mine to travel as much as I could before settling down, when a voice interrupted us. "Adam," it was his sister, walking toward us with an amused expression. "Mom's wondering if you're ever coming back to sit with us, or if you've officially adopted your new best friend here." I could feel the heat rush to my face, but Adam, as always, took it in stride. "Tell her I'm making a new travel buddy," he said casually, before turning back to me with a small, reassuring smile. But the moment had been broken, and suddenly, all the doubts I'd been pushing aside came rushing back. Was I reading too much into this? Was I just someone he'd chat with to pass the time, someone he'd forget as soon as we boarded that plane? The thought made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't prepared for. Adam must have noticed, because as soon as his sister left, he leaned in slightly, his voice quieter but no less steady. "Hey," he said, "don't let her get to you. She's just nosy. I'm enjoying this us." "I don't do this often." "Do what?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. "Let my guard down," he admitted, his eyes meeting mine with a sincerity that made my heart skip. "But with you, I don't know, it feels easy." Those words hung in the air, fragile and full of meaning, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. In that silence, I felt something shift, something I couldn't quite name but knew I didn't want to lose. And just like that, the tension of the moment melted away, replaced by the quiet, undeniable feeling that we were on the verge of something neither of us had expected but both of us wanted. The hours ahead were still uncertain, but for now, in that crowded terminal, it felt like anything was possible. By the time the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, it hit me I didn't want this delay to end. Hours ago, I'd been counting down the minutes, desperate to get on that plane and leave this chaotic airport behind. But now, the idea of stepping onto that plane, of losing this bubble Adam and I had built, felt like I was leaving something far more important than a delayed flight. We packed up our things in silence, the kind that's not awkward but filled with everything unsaid. I could see it in his expression too, the hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty, and something else I couldn't quite name but felt in my chest. Adam, the calm and composed one, looked vulnerable, and it made me want to say something, anything, to hold on to this connection just a little longer. As we walked toward the gate together, our steps slower than they needed to be, he glanced at me, his smile softer now, more thoughtful. "You know," he began, his voice low enough that it felt like a secret, "this isn't how I usually spend my time at airports. Talking to strangers," I teased, trying to lighten the mood even as my heart felt heavier with each step. "Meeting someone who makes me wish for more delays," he said, the honesty in his tone catching me off guard. He stopped walking for a moment, and I turned to face him, suddenly aware of the weight of the moment. "I don't want this to end either," I admitted, my voice quieter than I'd intended. It was the kind of confession that felt risky, vulnerable, but I couldn't hold it back. "I don't know what happens next, but I know I don't want this to just disappear." His expression shifted, softening into something I hadn't seen before. He reached into his bag, rummaging around for a moment, before pulling out a pen and grabbing my boarding pass. Scribbling quickly, he handed it back to me. His number, scrawled neatly in the corner, felt like a lifeline. "Text me when you land," he said, his voice steady but his eyes full of emotion. "I want to keep talking. I want to see you again." It wasn't a grand gesture, but it didn't need to be. It was real, honest, and in that moment, it meant everything. I nodded, clutching the boarding pass like it was the most important thing I'd ever held. "I will," I promised, the words carrying more weight than I could fully express. As we reached the gate, the announcement for boarding grew louder, the final call pulling us back into reality. Adam hesitated before stepping into the line, turning back to me one last time. "I'm glad we met, Logan. You made today better than I ever expected." The words settled over me, warm and bittersweet, and as I watched him walk toward the jetway, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just a passing moment. It was the start of something I couldn't yet define but already knew would matter. I boarded the plane with a strange mix of emotions, excitement, nervousness, and a quiet kind of joy I hadn't felt in a long time. As I buckled my seatbelt and stared at the folded boarding pass in my hand, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just a delay. It was a beginning, one I hadn't planned for but was ready to embrace. Meeting Adam had reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, that connections can happen in the most unexpected places, that sometimes the universe has its own way of bringing people together. And as the plane took off, leaving the terminal and its chaos behind, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while, hope. For the first time, I wasn't just looking forward to where I was going. I was looking forward to what might happen next. Love has a funny way of showing up when you least expect it, sometimes even in the middle of a crowded airport terminal, surrounded by delays, chaos, and overpriced snacks. What started as a frustrating day turned into one of the most memorable experiences of my life. It reminded me that sometimes, the most meaningful connections happen when you're not searching for them, when you're just going about your day and the universe decides to nudge you in a direction you didn't see coming. Meeting Adam wasn't just about passing the time during a delay, it was about realizing that even in the messiest, most unpredictable moments, there's beauty to be found. It's a reminder that love, connection, and hope can sneak up on you, turning the ordinary into something extraordinary. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had an unexpected encounter that changed your life? Maybe it wasn't in an airport, but at a coffee shop, on a bus, or even in the middle of a busy street. Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how the unexpected has shaped your life too. And if this story made you smile, if it reminded you of a moment that meant something to you, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories about love, connection, and the moments that make life unforgettable. And, of course, share this video with someone who might need a little reminder that love can show up anywhere, even when you're least prepared for it. Thanks for listening, and I can't wait to share more stories with you. Until next time, we are Pride Stories Unfiltered. Your #1 pride.